that may be even one angle in terms of approaching them. Certainly in the case of the Internet, of the Green Dam software, there was a strong sense that it was going to damage business for people who are trying to import technology into China.
I did. I wanted, first of all, just thank you. This is my first opportunity as a new commissioner to be able to participate, and so my primary objective in coming today was to learn to observe and to just state my desire and willingness on behalf of USAID to be part of the conversation. But this is a really interesting and important conversation that's happening right now. And I do apologize for having to leave early, but I would like to just pursue that conversation perhaps a little bit later, because very, very key questions that you're raising in terms of how we influence the rule of law and legal reforms, and whether or not we're having any impact with some of the things that we are trying. And I think it's probably a little bit early to assess what kind of impact we're having and whether it's sufficient to continue. But I think it's a good conversation to be having, and to be constantly looking at the ways that we're approaching this and what kind of effect it's having. I do think that there is a connection between economic governance, commercial law, and strengthening rule of law writ large. And I think it may not be as direct and as quick and immediate as we would want, but there is a connection there, and we have to explore that a little bit as well. But again, I just wanted to thank you and hopefully invite a conversation in the near future to continue the dialogue that's started here.
Thank you very much for joining us and for your offer of the continuing dialogue in the future. I wanted to go back to the number of folks who have disappeared over the last few months. It was about 2 months ago that Leader Reid led a delegation, a bipartisan delegation of senators to China, the largest delegation to our knowledge that's ever gone to China, 10 senators, bipartisan. And we were arriving there really in the midst of this situation with so many folks disappearing. And Sarah, I'm not sure if you covered this before I arrived or if someone else did, but if you did, I apologize. But could one of you that has a good grip on this kind of summarize what we know about the numbers who have disappeared, whether it's home detention, whether they've truly disappeared as in their families and friends do not know where they are, the patterns in terms of, are they mostly lawyer advocates, are they mostly folks who made unfavorable statements in their Twitter or email accounts and so forth? Just give us a quick summary of what that picture looks like. Ms. Lee, I'm sorry I missed that. Can you just give us the outlines of that again?
Well, you can supplement if I've missed anything. The disappearance seems to be a tactic applied to those who are somewhat known internationally. That's number one. Number two, somewhat known as being stubborn individuals who would not bend, have reputation as such. The number we have been able to verify is 30-some individuals in that category. There are about half lawyers, half of them activists, and almost all of them have some tie to the Jasmine Revolution. Either they tweeted, blogged, talked at a meeting, and being recorded, filmed, or used the Chinese equivalent of the Twitter to spread the words about the call for Jasmine protests. The two or three largest concentration of people being disappeared, including being criminally detained, are in Guangzhou, Chengdu, and Beijing. And in all three occasions, there were some meetings right before the so-called Jasmine Revolution protests. And large numbers of people who attended those meetings which could be a dinner. In 2 cases, I think they were gathering for dinner, and they have other topics. But during the meeting, somehow they talked about these protests, and that was either secretly filmed somehow or recorded their conversation. And then there are other individuals who've been picked up by tracing their Twitters or blogs. And these people are, in most cases, as I said, well-known activists. Not as well-known as Ai Weiwei, but known in the Chinese activist community. And what is interesting is they included the people who are petitioners, which means they're not political dissidents. They simply wanted to use the occasion to voice their own very, commonsensical kind of grievances, land, housing, jobs. And then there are quite a few numbers of young, almost, professional, semi-professional IT people who are very good on the internet. And then, of course, we already know the very brave human rights lawyers also included in this category.
So these profiles that you're mentioning, that's of the 30 who've disappeared?
In some cases, it's the line between disappearance and criminal detention, is blurred, because some then appeared or being identified, then being criminally detained.
Now, we have several hundred during that same time period who were put under house arrest, I believe. The profile roughly similar, but it's just kind of a lesser.
It's very hard to document because a lot of these people were warned sternly not to speak up, so they might be sent home and stay quiet. So we don't know they ever been disappeared or now being, released on bail, waiting for trial. The number should be several hundreds at least. And a lot of them, the family might be afraid to speak up. In one case, I want to mention a human rights lawyer who was disappeared for 2-3 weeks and then sent home. He was in such critical condition and clearly very, very severely tortured. And himself and his family being told not to speak a word. Otherwise, the consequences could be very grave. And today, even by now, after a few months, the person remains in critical condition, and attempts by activists to contact him to deliver, medicine or some kind of care, have all been turned back because the police are standing guard at his front.
Has the U.S. government formally inquired on behalf of the 30 or so disappeared, if you will?
I believe both the embassy and prior and after the human rights dialogue in Beijing, there have been statements made to call for the government to give an account of these individuals. And we have also repeatedly submitted various lists of those individuals. What happened, we all know during the human rights dialogue in Beijing, and Chinese officials first seriously warned against the U.S. delegate not to mention individual cases, but they did. And while they did, the Chinese officials at the dialogue actually came and well prepared with the documents of each and every individual mentioned. And for example, when Gao Zisheng was mentioned, they said Gao is free on business trip. And when Chen Guangcheng was mentioned, they said Chen Guangcheng was free at home. And when Ai Weiwei was mentioned, of course, he was being investigated for economic crimes. And same for Liu Xia and Liu Xiaobo's wife was said to be free. You can visit her anytime you want.
So largely here in the U.S., much of the portrayal of this was a kind of a warning shot, if you will, of the government to the Chinese citizens in regard to not to follow the example of the Arab Spring. And is that your sense of the motivation of this crackdown on individuals? Yes.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
That's the clearly the political agenda, which is to flicker out any kind of sparkle.
If I may, I guess I would try to I think of it in the context of something that's building for a while, and in the context of growing resources being given to this issue of stability maintenance, the creation of an extra legal or an expansion of an extra legal network of stability maintenance offices running down party committees, in a situation where a lot of these individuals have already repeatedly been detained and warned and things like that, that in some ways I could see the Chinese authorities in some ways using this as an excuse, or this was maybe a catalyst, maybe this was the opportunity for some of the more hardliners, like people like Zhou Yongkang, being able to grab onto this and say, look, we really need to nip this in the bud. But a lot of these people have been on the radar for a while. And I guess the other thing I would mention is, and these cases are much more difficult to verify in terms of the general practice of disappearances and abductions and taking people from their homes without warrants. I mean, you talk to Chinese refugees and you look at interviews with petitioners or Falun Gong practitioners or Uyghurs and Tibetans. I mean, some are really these people who are much more anonymous and often aren't the high-profile individuals. And these are pretty routine practices of people being picked up and taken to hotels, taken to schools, taken to so-called legal education centers. So I think, one thing I know that we would like to be able to do more of would be to try to document more of that. It's very, very difficult given the dangers and given just the anonymous quality and how hard it is to know who these people are. But I guess as I look at the current situation, that's kind of the lens through which I think it's important to place it in this broader context. I think beyond just, it may have been that if the Arab Spring type of, protest hadn't happened, then maybe there wouldn't have been this crackdown to this severity or within this concentrated period of time. But it's something that's been building for a while.
I just want to completely agree that I think this the Arab Spring exacerbated the sensitivity, but the sensitivity was there already. And one of the real concerns for those of us who are more in the academic community is that previously there was the government would follow the letter of the law, and the law often had exceptions which allowed them to say we're following the law, but according to article whatever we can extend the detention because of X, Y, or Z. But it was like Ai Weiwei. We were following the time that he was in detention before being formally arrested. And there's some terminology because it's the actual physically taking into custody is different than the formal arrest under Chinese law. And time was going and going. We're like, oh, well, they still have one more week under the criminal procedure law. And then it went past even what the criminal procedure law would allow. I'm like, oh, they're just flouting the law now. So that was the change, too, of not even trying to wrap it up in the trappings of it fits our formal law, which is particularly concerning. And when I was in Beijing last month when Ai Weiwei was still detained, and we asked some very high-level criminal procedure scholars about the case. And their response, and I think this was totally true, they said, we don't know about this case. You keep asking. It's not like we're hiding the ball. We just are not hearing, which is talking about how the information's not getting out. Mm-hmm. And then the next response is, and why do you keep focusing on this handful of cases? What about the thousands of other cases? And so there was also, I think, in some of the community there, just this, you foreigners are focusing on this small number. What about the masses of cases? That's what we're concerned about. So I think it's a hard time sometimes to get traction among some of the more high-profile people who we would hope would help out.
So one of the things I'd like to get a better feeling about is really related to protests throughout China. And you hear that there are a lot of labor protests, essentially folks who have lost their guarantee of a job, their guarantee of health care, maybe even their access to public schools. Then you hear about protests where land is being taken away from folks under the local officials' argument that, well, all the land belongs to the state, and then the officials take and resell it to developers and people are displaced. And so you hear that about kind of that section of protest, if you will. And so on this China trip, I was asking questions a little bit about what do you see in terms of broader grassroots reaction to the human rights side? And the reaction was, well, not so much, and not so much because people don't know about it. They don't have access to the information, and maybe not so much because they're occupied with trying to get through their life. And one of the things that I raised was, well, here we're seeing these cities with these massive numbers of new housing towers. And as I there was a little bit of a description by some officials saying, by American officials, saying, well, partly that goes hand in hand with the village policies where there's less guaranteed employment, less guaranteed health care, less guaranteed public schools, and so folks are shifting to the cities. And so I was asking, well, is there a massive reaction to this, kind of people being economically forced off their land going to the city? And the general reaction, I'm sharing this because I want to get your all's perspectives, said, well, not so much. That many of the young folks who are moving to the cities, they have fully embraced this dream of being able to dress the way they would like, being able to buy their condominium or their apartment in the city, and having a motorcycle or a car, and that isn't particularly driving a huge reaction. So in the kind of, as we think about kind of the economic labor issues and the corruption issues, is there any form of kind of broader reaction on the human rights side, or is it really the lack of information and the kind of the set of other issues folks have to deal with weighing in?
I guess it's one of these tricky things, as Ms. Lewis had mentioned, to gauge this. One thing I found just speaking to Chinese people and the ones who have become activists, a lot of them didn't start off as activists. Or petitioners especially. A lot of them started off as people just as similar to the ones that you had just described, but at some point, for some reason beyond their control, they ran into this system. And when they ran into the system, in a lot of cases, partly because a lot of the rhetoric about rights and a growing rights consciousness in Chinese society, they had faith in the law and in the system, and they went to petition, or they tried to find some way of dealing with the injustice that they encountered. And then they ran into more problems. Now, some people, when they get that first level of threat, they may just back off. But then you also have people who will continue, and then they kind of continue in this lifestyle. It just gets harder and harder because they're running into more and more oppression. One question and one game I think the Chinese authorities are playing is when you have a system that is this corrupt and that there are this many abuses of power going on, there's so many people each day running up against this system. And one question is, how do you keep that balance, and how do you keep a lid on keeping people also not informed of the extent to which this is happening and other people are encountering similar things. So they have some sense that there are certain injustices, and in a lot of ways the internet has opened up room for more conversations on a certain level related to these issues. But in terms of some of the systemic problems, a lot of people don't realize or don't encounter it until they run up against it themselves. And that's really, again, like I think that's almost like this, I don't know, this game that the CCP is playing in terms of how long they can keep a lid on it. So in a lot of ways, it's such a complex country. You have people with so many different experiences. It's that path of kind of running into the system and then that generating more activism. That's one of the things that I've observed in just the sheer rights consciousness of Chinese people being more aware of the fact that they might have rights and these ideas, in a way that's maybe not necessarily always talking about systemic change and democracy, but a little bit more of a maybe instinctive sense of having rights and wanting justice.
And I think beyond just sort of the individual injustices that people are petitioning and trying to get help with grievances, that we are seeing very high-profile cases that are galvanizing larger groups. So, for example, the case of Zhao Zuohai, who was a man who was convicted of murder. A headless body was literally found at the bottom of the well. Zhao Zuohai had a quarrel with someone who had since disappeared, so they said, well, this must be the body of the man you quarreled with, you did it. He was sentenced to death. That was commuted into a long prison sentence. 10 years later, whoa, the dead body back alive. The man who was supposedly the victim was alive. So if you want the clearest case, you don't need DNA evidence to say this was a wrongful conviction. There was no murder victim. This person was there. And that case got on the internet. It went viral. And then finally, after it went viral through informal news channels, the official press had to respond to it. And that case was seen as one of the pushes to get these new evidence rules out that had been circulating behind the scenes, but there's also been deaths in detention. We've seen this a number of times with police coming out with excuses like this person died because they were playing a game like Blindsman Bluff. You know, these sort of, they don't even meet the last test. So we are seeing some of those kind of cases, I think,